newcomers as they come in. So a very warm welcome. You can pipe down for me for a second, please. A very warm welcome to the first of our DDI talk series for this semester. We've got four other events over the course of the semester, and it's really lovely to see so many people here for the first one in the series. So we'll start with a couple of little housekeeping rules before I introduce our speakers. So the talk today is going to be recorded, but the question and answer session is not. So feel free to ask all of your difficult and awkward questions to our speakers. Please make sure your phones are on silent before we start so that we don't get interruptions to the talks. And also there's not going to be subtitles during the presentations today, but there is also going to be a transcript attached to the talks once it's released on the GDI YouTube channel after. So we are very lucky to have three brilliant speakers with us. So worried, David. We've got three brilliant speakers with us for the first talk in our series this year, who will be talking about the recently concluded FutureDAMS project. And each of them is going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and after that we'll move on to a question and answer and a discussion session. So first up we're going to have Professor David Hume. He's with us in the Global Development Institute and is a Professor of Development Studies. He's been the Chief Executive Officer of the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre, and more importantly, he was the Principal Investigator and CEO for FutureDAMS. Our second speaker is going to be Professor Julian Haru. Oh, we switched order. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Mohammed Bashir. And Mohammed researches the economics of coupled human and natural systems with a focus on river basins. He's a Knowledge Exchange Fellow at the School of Engineering at the University of Manchester. His career involved participating in water management research and consultancy projects in a variety of regions around the world, including Northwest and East Africa, South Asia and the Middle East. And his work focuses on designing balanced solutions for complex water resource systems using state-of-the-art river system and economic modelling approaches coupled with artificial intelligence techniques. And then our third speaker is going to be Professor Julian Haru, who holds the position of Chair in Water Engineering in the Department of Mechanical, Aerospace and Civil Engineering here at Manchester. He has a PhD from University of California, Davis, in the Water Resources Engineering in Water Resources Engineering and Economics, and a master's degree from Cornell University. And Professor Haru was the Research Director on FutureDAMS. So I am really glad to have all of these people with us today and looking forward to learning more about the project. David, over to you.
Thanks very much. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. It's a great privilege to be able to start the lectures off this year. And it's just a great feeling. It's like being back in the real world again. So thank you very much for taking me out of a virtual world and taking me back into the real world. The three of us will be talking today. We're trying to synthesize a project that's been running for almost 5 years. It's operated in depth in 5 countries, but it's covered several other countries. There's been a team of more than 100 academics and researchers and some people involved in specific engineering projects and NGOs involved in it. We're going to try and present a synthesis from this vast body of work. So it's going to be presented quite quickly and we're not going to be able to go into depth, but hopefully in the questions and answers you can explore with us particular issues that you've got. And certainly if you go to the FutureDAMS website, you'll find we've got a vast number of working papers. We've now got a vast number of published papers and the whole set of resources on that. And there are also 2 websites that will take you into major modelling web pages if you want on that. So let's get going. We call the project FutureDAMS, but we have been working more broadly, looking particularly at water management systems, so canals and other ways of managing water, and looking particularly at how water, energy, food and the environment can be integrated so one can actually take decisions about investments or actions that will change the way, particularly in which water is used, but also it's thinking about how it might be used to generate energy, to produce food, or more broadly in terms of the environment and biodiversity. We put the dams in, but it is actually the design and assessment of these WEFE mega systems. So as I've said, we may go broader. If we think of sort of development goals at the moment, though, although they're not always pursued, 193 nations at the United Nations have agreed to pursue the Sustainable Development Goals. And when you look at the idea of having new dams or having major investments in water management systems, then there's a great potential, and people are often interested in pursuing the Sustainable Development Goals. Sometimes pursuing one of them, such as generating electricity or providing potable water, sometimes in terms of achieving several of the goals through the same activity. So there's this great potential, but there's also this great potential downside. Poorly designed dams and water management systems exacerbate social and political instability. They can undermine institutions, they can undermine social relations, they can lead to hostility between people who live upstream and people who live downstream, people who get the electricity, people who don't get the electricity. They can degrade the environment. And also, these are very big investments, $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion and more. And if you invest that much money and you don't get a return on it, then you're creating debts that are going to have to be paid off in the future. At FutureDAMS, we started off with a set of what appeared to be fairly straightforward and direct questions early on. We were asking, what's happening now? We wanted to understand what was happening in terms of major investments, about changing the way in which water systems are affected, and to look at who's involved in selecting and designing and financing, what approaches, tools, how do they decide what to do, what sort of incentives are there about which dams to select, which investments to move on. We asked about what should be improved, what technical knowledge or what political or economic knowledge is required for new dams to maximise and appropriately allocate the nexus benefits so that systems become more resilient and sustainable, and that we minimise and reduce potential for conflict or for socio-ecological loss. And we looked also at the decision-making processes, and particularly at the way, whether they are participatory, the forms of people who are involved in decision-making and creating knowledge. And finally, we've asked the how, what skills, what approaches, what processes, what tools could help us to improve what's happening. Those might be the modelling tools, which Mohammed and Julian will talk about, the highly technical tools. They may be more the tools for stakeholder analysis, for trying to think about how you get citizens or informed people to talk about what sort of world they want and how major investments may or may not achieve what they're interested in. Now, we are at the moment still in a process of a global boom in hydropower dam construction. There are many types of dam being constructed. Some of the ones we'll talk about are irrigation dams. Some of them are creating potable water for urban populations. But there's been a real boom in dams, and particularly in hydropower dams, since the early part of this century. You sort of see the blue dots and where they're scattered around across Eastern Europe, moving into the Middle East. Major plans in the Himalayas and moving on into China and Southeast Asia. Scattered around Africa, a whole set of proposals for major dams and major investments proceeding or potentially planned in Latin America, and in Canada is also been looking. So there's a whole set. I mean, the estimate by these colleagues, Zafal et al., was of 3,900 dams that are either being built or have very recently been built, or serious money is being spent on working out whether to build them. As I've said a bit earlier, that there are potential benefits of dams. Many of these seem to have been benefits that have helped European countries, the USA, Canada, Japan and many other countries industrialise, move into urbanising their populations and move into being able to provide economic growth and much higher levels of human development. And these benefits, I mean, are listed here. One can generate power, hydropower, from dams. Often that is seen as relatively green, but one can challenge that. And most recently, one's begun to think about dams for power storage. You could use them for generating power, but you could use them to store future power that you will need. So when you've got relatively unreliable renewable resource sources, you could actually use dams for storage, to store when you're overproducing and to generate power when your renewables are not producing. You can use them for water supply, and particularly as we move into an urbanizing world, then major challenges in that. I think our African Cities Research Centre is looking at that, and you'll find that that is a challenge that they're looking at. How do you get many relatively arid parts of Africa to be able to supply large urban populations? They can be used for irrigation, used extensively in Asia for irrigation. Often it's argued quite successfully. In Africa, then the irrigation initiatives have not been as successful. They can be used for flood control. When you get heavy drops, heavy rainfall, you can trap those waters behind a dam, and then you could release them at a more gentle pace downstream if you can get the design right. They can be used for navigation. You can actually use the reservoirs that you create as a form of transport. They're often used in mines as a pollution control, to keep debris and to keep tailings back. And increasingly, if you look at advanced industrial economies like the UK and the USA, they're seen as a form of recreation, but recreation based upon the reservoirs and the water resources, and sometimes the surrounding forests are seen as a potentially major benefit. But there are also problems among us, a whole series of other impacts, and I've quickly divided these into the downstream and the upstream. In terms of hydrology, then if you build a dam or intervene in a major water system, then you change the flood, you change its scale, its timing, its duration. That may be good, but it may create problems because you've changed a system that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people may have got used to. You change the water quality, the temperature and the water clarity changes. That may, if you get it right, be for the better, but it could also be that you get it for the worse and you create temperatures that will cause health problems. You get channel changes. You get erosion in areas where erosion would not have occurred. The channels may become unstable, and delta systems may be impacted on in major ways. You get major ecological changes. When you're looking downstream, then quite often the aquatic ecosystems change. The fisheries that existed may be swept away and something else may replace them. And wetlands, which are often important bases for wildlife, may be very much modified. And then you get the socio-economic changes. The fishing systems have to change. Quite often there are new agricultural systems. There may be opportunities for tourism. And at the bottom then, there are questions about debt. Will national debt increase? When you look upstream, then there's reservoir resettlement. If you make a reservoir in most parts of the world, you have to move people out of the villages and the towns in which they live, and that is seen as threatening health, threatening well-being, sometimes as challenging cultures. Again, if I relate things to the UK, the Plaid Cymru, the Welsh independence movement, comes very much out of the British building reservoirs in Wales and the resentment that created when Welsh villages were flooded and people had to move out. Mosquito-borne diseases, malaria, but also dengue nowadays. Total patterns of change, and people may be experiencing much more severe problems because of resettlement. There's livelihoods. What do people do when they move? Quite commonly it's suggested that they farm, but there are other issues, but certainly studies around the world, certainly in Asia and Africa and Latin America, have shown that people who are given a new livelihood quite often move into poverty. The plans for the income they earn, the way in which they live, are not delivered. There's sedimentation, and certainly many dams fill up with silt very quickly so that they cannot achieve the goals that have been set over the next 50 or 100 years. And then there's a whole set of lake ecology questions. We've mentioned fisheries, but particularly there is the issue of methane, and particularly in lowland tropical areas, then the release of methane from reservoirs seems to be very high. And when we live in a world in which we're trying to reduce methane emissions, then certainly any new dam challenges that. Quickly on the social sciences, because I'm already running out of time. We've tried to be interdisciplinary, both within the social sciences and with our modelling team. That's certainly been, I think, successful in the macroeconomics. Julian and Mohammed may get time to refer about this, but they've been able to look at the impacts of how, if you model what a dam is going to do in terms of water and energy, you may be able to relate that to what the impacts will be on the macro economy. On the more social science side, then, we've identified innovative tools for looking at stakeholder engagement that are accepted by scientists, and particularly the idea of citizen assemblies is getting a lot of support from natural and physical scientists and technological specialists, and it does look as though there may be some ways in which one can try and get the recognition of the importance of broad sets of stakeholders, of participation by citizens in these sorts of decisions. There may be entry points there. But we do have to admit that political economy and systems modelling don't mix well. A number of reasons in that. Have I gone too fast? Have I turned them around? No, I've lost one. Okay, I mean, there are a number of reasons why modelling and the scientific approaches and the social science approaches have hit problems. Often it is that the focus of the scientists and the engineers involved in looking at intervening in water management systems are different from the social scientists. Often for the social scientists, scientists tend to look at doing research for water management. How do we manage this better? Tends to be the question that engineers, hydrologists, ecologists, and many economists asked. The social scientists are often saying, what is happening in water management? Anthropologists, political scientists, and others are inclined to look at the engineers and the scientists either as being naive and not understanding the politics of the decisions that they're involved in, or otherwise to look at them as a source for collecting information from. And this can lead to deep tensions. I think we managed to keep those out of our project, but certainly we had major concerns at times. We work in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, and in the Tigris-Euphrates, around Jordan and the Middle East. These are all areas in which what might be a logical question for a political economist, such as who's getting the bribes from this project, appears to be reasonable. But if you ask that question, then the modelers and the engineers will get zero access to data. They will simply be removed from the conversation. And so being part of an interdisciplinary team is seen as potentially having dangers. Luckily, I think our interdisciplinary teams manage not to ask the wrong questions in the wrong place. If you want to look at the stakeholder engagement, then take a look at the guide that we've produced, which both looks at its normative potential, but also looks at its political economic use and the way that stakeholder engagement can be used to pretend that you're consulting citizens, to pretend that you're consulting people who are being resettled, when in fact the decisions have already been taken. That's a great review of the overall scene. And I've talked about the political economic analysis in a bit of detail already there. The modelling we accepted has the potential, the social scientists looking at it thought the modelling has a real potential to better inform decision makers and politicians. The models are now incredibly sophisticated. They can look at millions of iterations, not just 3 or 4. But in the contemporary political environment, the global political environment we live in, of populism, of identity politics, of big men politics, contested accountability and corruption, a world of flexible finance where multiple international and domestic sources of finance can be blended together, but nobody's actually told what those sources are, then it does mean that technical analysis can also be marginalised or ignored. And quickly, just to finish off with examples from some of the work we looked at. We looked at the Pulugu Dam in Ghana. This is a very expensive irrigation dam. It's being managed by hydropower specialists who don't know much about irrigation. The social planning hasn't occurred for it, even though it should have occurred already a few years ago. It looks like it is going to be extremely costly and yield few benefits. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, centralised decision-making, meant it overcame a number of international and domestic oppositions, but it bypassed technical expertise, and it looks as though the efficiency of the dam, its viability, will be undermined. In Rwanda, then, there's been an electricity boom, partly driven by hydropower, and the Rwandese government is having to buy back electricity that it cannot use at an incredibly high price. It's actually really adding to national debt incredibly. And it's no wonder one has all these protest movements which are against dams and against major investments. Sorry I've taken too long. Apologies, Rose.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the modeling results that we've done, and here I will focus on river basins and economics. So I'll talk about three kind of analyses that we worked on. So the first one is looking at just economics and try to figure out how to intervene in economies in a way that help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The second one, we took the same economic approach, and then we linked that together with engineering, river basin models, and we tried to figure out how we can build dams and intervene in river systems in a way that achieve some economic goals, like, how to maximize GDP, how to improve employment, and so on. Then we realized that climate change is going to have a huge impact on river systems and economies as well. So what we did is we brought climate change into the picture, and then we tried to look at how to adapt to climate change in the future. So you can look at these three topics as incremental topics that will use similar approaches. So the first topic was looking at how to design economic policies to achieve sustainable development. And for that, we came up with a framework. And here you can see it on the screen. You don't need to follow all the steps there. But the whole approach starts by identifying some sustainable development goals that a certain government would want to achieve, and then come up with instruments that the certain government or country would be able to change or would be willing to change to achieve these goals. Then we build a model, a simulation model, to simulate the economy. And this kind of models, it's called computable general equilibrium models. So these are models that can capture interactions within an entire economy. You can use it to track employment, GDP, over time. So you can simulate scenarios and apply shocks and see how the economy would react. Then we took that model, we linked it to artificial intelligence, and what artificial intelligence does, it looks at all, it kind of talks with the model and tells us the best ways to intervene in the economy to achieve certain goals. So that's what artificial intelligence would help us do. It helps us simplify complex systems by suggesting solutions that are efficient or Pareto optimal. Then the idea from that, after you come up with a few solutions that are all efficient, then you bring these to stakeholders and to decision makers, and you tell them, select one of them. If they can select one of them, then that's good. If they cannot, then you go back again, and we do the whole modeling exercise again by changing the models, changing the instruments, and changing the kind of problem that we're looking at. So this is the entire approach. So we applied this approach to the economy of Egypt. We tried to figure out how to intervene in the Egyptian economy in a way that maximizes GDP, maximize the income of households, urban households, rural households, minimize inequalities in income between households, and reduce overall CO2 emissions. And the plot you see here on the screen is basically, it's called parallel coordinates plot. And we don't really need to get into the details of that, but if you look at this plot, the vertical axes, or the axes that you see here, they show the metrics that we considered in designing economic policies. And all the lines, each line represent one way to intervene in the economy. So, for example, the GDP, the line which is marked with the label says high GDP. This is a line that that comes with a policy that helps the Egyptian government maximize GDP. So overall, what this approach does, it helps us develop this kind of graphs, and then we take this kind of graphs to decision makers who need to pick one line, hopefully, and then be able to implement it and achieve the performance that they would like to achieve. This paper was published recently in Nature Communications, so I would invite you to have a look at it. It's open access, and everybody can get a copy. Then the second application that I want to talk about is, we took the economy models, and then we looked at river basin models, and we realized that dams and interventions in river systems, these are really large-scale decisions. And normally, governments, especially in developing countries, they want to build dams to achieve certain economy-wide goals. So they build a dam to increase employment or to boost GDP, and so on. So it only made sense that we look at these interventions and their impacts on the economy as well. So what we did is we took the same economy models, which are CGE models. This is the box on that right side, but we linked them with engineering river system models. This is the green box here. And what the engineering models quantify is the crop yields that we can get from the river basin under certain scenarios, the amount of water that we can supply to municipalities and to industries, and the amount of electricity that can be generated. Then this information goes into the economy models, which based on these resource availability constraints can tell us how the economy is going to evolve under different scenarios. And then there's feedback between the models, because also the way the economy evolves also impacts the demand for resources. So we came up with this modeling framework, and we have the models talk to each other in simulations. We use this modeling framework to look at an example from East Africa. And so we looked at one of the dams that Professor Hume just mentioned, which is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. We're able to look at if we operate the dam in different ways, how is GDP going to change over the next 30 years, for example. So the time series that you see on the left side, this shows, for example, the first one shows how the Egyptian GDP is going to change as a result of changing the operation of a dam in Ethiopia. So, and this is very important, because when these countries sit together and try to negotiate how to build and operate dams, they need to keep these economic impacts in mind. This paper is also published in Nature Communications, and it's open access, and you can get a copy from this link. Then the last application that I want to talk about today is, we had the same modeling framework from the previous application, which is the economics and the river basin. But on top of that, we brought in climate change, because climate change is happening, and it will continue to have impacts on river systems and on economies. So we took the same, so the two yellow boxes, these are the same, this is the result of the previous application. We added this whole new other boxes to it to kind of bring in the impact of climate change. So picking climate change scenarios, bias correcting them, feeding them into what we call hydrological models to kind of bring down the impacts of climate change into impacts in terms of how river flows are going to change, for example. And then we put all of that into the two yellow boxes that we had before to be able to look at how the climate is going to change. Then, because we don't know, there's high uncertainty about how the climate is going to change in the future, our aim was to come up with adaptive management plans. So in an adaptive management plan, you don't come up with fixed plans and then stick with them for the future. You come up with a plan for the short term, but you also come up with a criteria for how to adapt that plan over time as climate change unfolds. And this is called adaptive management. And what we did is we took that framework that I presented in the previous slide, we applied it on the Nile basin again, and we tried to come up with adaptive plans for dams in the Nile basin. And this is again a similar plot to the one I showed earlier, but here you will notice that the metrics that are shown on this plot, so the labels on top of each axis there, this is not only economics this time, but it includes economics, it includes electricity, hydropower, irrigation supply, and so on. So because we're looking at engineering and economics together and the two type of models together, then we're able to look at how the system performs considering both economy and engineering metrics.
Okay, great. Thank you, David and Mohammed. So now I'm going to talk about the same, it's still the same project, and rather than how to connect water systems and river basins with economies, we looked at how to connect river basins with energy systems. But if I can just start more generally, the problem in the real world is that people allocate funding to projects. That's what governments do, or international organizations. They have a budget. They need to decide every year how to spend the budget, okay? And they often do it in not a very scientific and advanced way. It's often a very human and political process for how organizations assign budgets to projects, right? And what this project tries to do is for complex human natural systems that link water, energy, environment, and economy, and food production, how to try to rationally allocate resources. So when you're intervening in a water, energy, food, environment system, there's millions of ways you can intervene in that system. You can enact new policies, you can make new investments. There's unlimited, it's an infinite amount of way that a government can intervene. So here we're really doing a quintessential GDI thing, which is saying, okay, how can a university advise a government on what is the rational package of measures to put together to interact in an economy? Now you have to know that what we did is something that we have the luxury of doing in a university environment, but in the real world, what we do, this is totally crazy, okay? When we spoke to governments about the possibility of using these tools, they really thought that we were a combination of strange and dangerous people, because we're advocating making decisions based on rationally providing benefits to different geographic and socioeconomic social groups. And that, you need to realize how crazy that is, right? No, governments don't do that. It's politics that does that. Politics allocates resources to projects to keep the socio-political system working. Here we're advocating for a completely open and transparent way to assess the link between interventions and socioeconomic physical world impacts. And so even though many of you might be thinking, okay, I'm falling asleep here, this is a modeling project, what does this have to do with me? What this is actually doing is allocating resources in a rational way that can be defended in public. And let me just tell you how unpopular, once people understood what we were doing, some people did not like us at all. My favorite story is when I went to the Ministry of Energy and I said, so as you can tell, this decision-making approach is quite interesting, and it would make sense if considered an interministerial panel with different people from the different ministries. Because new dams affect the whole social, agricultural, environmental, economic system of the country, if you're picking where to put large dams that cost billions of dollars, you should involve other people. At that point, the ministry people said, okay, we're no longer talking to you. You're advocating us sharing decision-making power with other ministries. You now have become a danger to us institutionally. We're not talking to you anymore. And they asked me to leave the ministry. So it can get, so you might think, oh, rationally allocating budgets to maximize benefits and their distribution. Oh, that's a very innocent thing to do. No, if you do that, in many cases, you will get in big trouble, in big trouble. Okay, and we got, so I just spoke 4 minutes, but this was not according to my slides, so now I have to panic. Now I have to speak much more quickly. Okay, let's get back to the engineering. So in this process of trying to allocate things rationally, what we realize is that river basins connect with power systems. In many cases, decision-making is not taking that into account. So just like Mohammed showed mathematical models that connect a mathematical model of the river basin to the mathematical model of an economic system, we also connected river basins to power systems to try to see what would be the influence that they have on each other. This is very relevant in countries where there's a lot amount of the power that comes from hydropower, for example, China. Here in the UK, it's not very relevant. Actually, the only connection between water and energy in England is for cooling. So if you want to have a power plant, you need to cool it. You need to take water from the river and evaporate that water to cool down the power plant. So even in England, where there's no hydropower, there's still intense connections between water and energy. But in other countries like China, like in many countries in Africa, the links between water and energy are very, very, they're complex to represent in a mathematical model, but they're quite useful to take into account. So what we were doing in this project is we were advising the country of Ghana, and we were advising them how should they invest billions of dollars into their water and energy infrastructure system to have combined benefits in both systems. And so what you could see here is the situation was that we have water demands, energy demands increasing. We have solar potential in parts of the country. We have demand for energy in the south of the country where the big cities are. And so we want to meet these future energy demands. We want to reduce CO2 emissions. We want to minimize hydroecological damage, and we want to minimize conflicts between the different sectors that use water. And then in this particular exercise, we said, well, what would happen if you built no new dams? You just keep the dams you have, but you don't build new ones. What other infrastructure would you build? And so we use the same modeling method that Mohammed used, is where we make these physical mathematical model of the whole system, and then we connect it to an artificial intelligence search algorithm and tell the algorithm, okay, you find us the best investments that maximize all the benefits. And so this is the same plot that Mohammed showed, where we just have different benefits, and each line represents a package of investments. So if you would, you can pick any one of those lines, and each one of those lines represents a package of interventions, typically policy changes combined with infrastructure investments. And then you can achieve that level of agricultural yield. Load curtailment is how much energy is not provided. Emissions, hydroecological alteration, right? So it's the same framework. And what it is, it's a rational framework to link human interventions to results. We could call them KPIs, key performance indices, or metrics of performance, which is the things that you're seeing on the left side here. These are objectives. And then on the right side, you're seeing summary variables of how much intermediate renewables, how many kilometers of transmission lines are you going to build in Ghana, and then how much bioenergy are you going to use, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, and this is, okay, so that was Ghana. We did the same thing for all of East Africa. So East Africa would like to build a power pool. You know that in the United States and in Europe, we have now combined energy systems, which are no longer centrally planned. It's the market. And so governments just let the market go. And the market allocates energy plants in a very efficient way when everything's working fine. And so a lot of countries like East Africa are considering this. They're considering to allow the energy system to act as a market so that private actors invest in infrastructure where it makes economic sense. And so we're trying to advise them on how that power system market could impact the water system. Now, there's a lot of conflict in East Africa because there's one river for about 600 million people. So you can imagine if you start making big energy changes which impacts the rivers, you can get into a lot of trouble very quickly. So that's why Mohammed is famous, because he writes about this water energy system in East Africa, and many people are interested. Anyways, this is the tool that we built, and it's used in the same framework. We build the model, we try different intervention packages, and then we optimize it using artificial intelligence. Okay, I see I'm rapidly running out of time here. Right, so final thoughts for this FutureDAMS project. Well, the project, in the year 2000, someone quite famous, Nelson Mandela, worked on this new framework by the UN where they were trying to evaluate, are dams a good idea for humanity? And you can see that it's called Dams in Development, a new framework for decision making. And they made a very good effort, but they thought it was a difficult task. Here you can see Nelson Mandela presenting this 20 years ago. And what they said, one of the summary things that they said was, well, it's easy to criticize dams, but it's not that easy to find a better way to invest in water, energy, food systems. And so what we tried to do is we took this comment to heart, and we tried to propose a techno-scientific, open to political science and governance approach to do this in a more rational way. But I'm not sure we succeeded. We did the technical version that works well in universities, but I'm not sure we succeeded in implanting it in the real world. I suspect that might take 10, 20, 30, 50 years to do that. So the key outputs, David talked about this. Well, there's lots of papers you can see on the website. We produced the guidance on the stakeholder processes. We produced this multi-criteria, multi-sector framework for designing interventions and selecting investments in water, energy, food, environment systems. And then one other fun thing that we did, which is quite unusual, is that we created a consumer product. By the way, this was a $10 million project, 8 million pounds, so it was well funded. And one of the things we did is we created a consumer product, which is very unusual for university projects. And we added actually two, which are at these websites. These are simulation platforms to help you build the kind of models that we described online. So they're quite nice, and the university actually encouraged us to start a little spin-out company to maintain these tools so that they don't disappear. And that took 2 years and was interesting, but we've been successful. And so it looks like this. Now you can go on this website, and you click login, and it's kind of like Google Docs. You can open, your model, and then you can create it there. You can share it with different people, just like you would share a Microsoft Word document or a Google Docs document. So we're hoping that with these new generation of tools, we can move the system kind of from a technical point of view, move the ways governments intervene in the complex systems. We can try to move it from kind of closed-door, opaque decision-making to these more transparent, multi-actor, multi-attribute type decision-making processes. And this is just a little bit more detail about this system. You can see it's a very fun kind of cloud-based platform. So we had a good time with this, and it actually works, which is pretty amazing. And so the university is encouraging us to make that work in the long term online. In terms of future work, so the project is now finished. A few of the case studies have asked us to continue working, so we're still working. We're still doing this work in the Middle East, looking at the Tigris-Euphrates basin, which is the river basin that covers Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. So that's a very interesting area. And then we're also working with the International Water Management Institute, IMI, who has a big project called Nexus Gains, and we're working in Central Asia, in the Indus Basin in South Asia, and also in South Africa. And then we're trying to maintain the online platforms in the long term. So these are things that are happening in the future. And now we're going to move to the discussion, in which I think the four of us are going to come up here to the front. And so this is where you come in, right? Were we successful? We used $10 million. You can build 1 or 2 hospitals with $10 million, right? So did we waste the government's money? I don't know. We proposed a very sophisticated way to allocate resources in complex systems. There's no client. No one is interested in this. No one is adopting this now. I'm hoping in 10 years this will be used. But as of today, there's no client. No one is asking us to do this. So, it's up to you to decide, and in the discussion is, was this a failure? Is this a good idea? Should universities be doing this? Is it a good aspiration for governments to allocate resources rationally? Or is it okay if governments allocate resource in an imperfect political way, which is non-transparent? I don't know. I'm an engineer. That's not my business. But you're at the Global Development Institute, so you guys must have an opinion, right? And this is very relevant. Look at for example, I see I think there might be people from China here. The Belt and Road Initiative, right? That's the Chinese government spending what? I don't know, $50 billion? Allocating infrastructure around the world. Well, how do you pick which infrastructure projects to choose? Why don't they use this technique? I'm an engineer. But you aren't engineers. You guys are thinkers. You're at the Global Development Institute, including David. So you have responsibility to think, how can tools like this, or how should tools like this, how should frameworks like this be used? Or maybe they should not be used. Maybe we should just go back into our academic hole from which we came and never come out again. Some people would wish us to do that. Anyways, let's have a discussion now. So I hope everyone will feel comfortable discussing. You can discuss what is done in your home country. You can discuss all sorts